Good evening, everybody, and a very warm welcome to Glover Cottages. We pay respect to the Gadigal people, the traditional owners of the land on which we meet, and to all the Indigenous peoples of Australia. We join them in furthering the search to understand and care for our world. Due to the COVID crisis, it's now been many months since we've all met at Glover Cottages, and even tonight it's not our usual event. Instead, we're recording our interns debate. There have been concerns for many decades in Australian opinion about whether Australia spends too much on defence and not enough on foreign relations and aid. And that's the subject that the interns are going to debate tonight. To give their subject its full title, they're going to examine the proposition that Australia should prioritise diplomatic and development efforts over military spending. We're following the usual pattern in which there are 3 speakers for the affirmative and 3 speakers for the negative, and that will be followed by an adjudication. Before the debate begins, I'd just like to run through very briefly who our speakers are. I'll give you first of all the speakers on the affirmative side, the first of whom is Nimaya Mallikahewa, who's currently completing a Bachelor of International Studies at the University of New South Wales. The second speaker on the positive side is Evangeline Larsen, who graduated with a dual bachelor's degree including Asian, Middle East and North African Studies and Government, International Relations and French and Francophone Studies last year, and is now preparing to work as a mediator. The third speaker on the affirmative side is Thomas Shortridge, who's currently completing a Bachelor of Arts in History and Government, along with International Relations, at the University of Sydney. The first speaker on the negative side will be Amelia Proudlove. Amelia is currently completing a Bachelor of Arts and Law and specialising on international war law and security studies. The second speaker on the negative side is Wendy Hu. Wendy's currently completing a degree in commerce, law, finance at the University of Sydney and has previously worked as a congressional intern at the US House of Representatives. And the final speaker on the negative side is Marcus McCulloch, who has completed a Bachelor of Arts and Political Economy degree along with Spanish and Latin American Studies at the University of Sydney, and is now undertaking an honours thesis in political economy. So those are our speakers, and it's time for me to hand over to them.
Good evening, everyone. We, the Affirmative team, strongly believe that Australia should prioritise diplomatic and development efforts over military spending. Australia must not favour military deterrence over proactive diplomatic relations and the provision of development aid. We believe that these efforts should form a central tenet of government spending rather than facing the consistent budget cuts that diplomatic and development funding and, by large, the Department of Foreign Affairs and Trade has experienced over the last 10 years. Today, as the first speaker, I will address 3 key points. First, Australia's responsibility to our neighbours, focusing on our moral debt to the Pacific Islands. Second, the long-term effectiveness of diplomatic and development efforts over short-term military action in assuring enduring security for Australia. And third, the financial efficiency of prioritising diplomacy over defence spending. Our second speaker, Evangeline, will address 2 points. First, that diplomacy is integral in the event of crises such as COVID-19, and second, the ability of diplomatic relations and development aid to connect Australia to other countries where relations would otherwise be non-existent. I will begin our case by touching on Australia's role as the major power in the region and the moral debt and responsibility we have towards the Pacific Islands. Australia has indeed stepped up, being the biggest regional donor to the Pacific Islands, more recently with its commitment of an extra $1.4 billion to infrastructure, women and girls empowerment, education and sport. Such initiatives include high-speed internet through the Coral Sea cable to Papua New Guinea and the Solomon Islands, the Australian Infrastructure Finance Facility to the Pacific, and the Pacific Labour Scheme. Growing a Pacific community and bringing up the countries neighbouring Australia to a high developmental standard, equipped to be resilient and continuing to grow, will be of immense importance in assuring Australia's own national interests. Not only does the provision of development aid fulfill our obligation to the Pacific Islands in ensuring their continued growth and economic advancement, the strategic importance of building such relations cannot be overlooked. If Australia wishes to remain the key provider of aid and development assistance to the Pacific, where China may otherwise step in, strong people-to-people connections on the ground through diplomatic relations are critical for the success of ongoing initiatives, negotiations, and agreements. However, Australia must be sure to address key concerns such as climate change and pollution in the Pacific. The Pacific Islands have been disproportionately affected by climate change, with rising sea levels that will see entire nations submerged by 2030. Australia must redirect efforts to address these clear national security issues. Military spending will do little to convince leaders in the Pacific, and despite many other developmental efforts, Australia shows little regard for environmental protection. Ultimately, deterrence will be of little help to many of these island states if their actual countries will be non-existent in 10 years. Prioritising not only diplomatic efforts and developmental efforts, but showing a true commitment to our Pacific neighbours is critical. Secondly, we argue that Australia's decreased diplomatic corps and foreign aid budget will be detrimental to Australia's long-term security in ways which cannot be addressed by throwing money at the military. A shrinking overseas presence is not ideal during a time of international uncertainty, particularly if Australia wishes to establish itself as a middle power. Favouring defence over diplomatic efforts do not play to Australia's strengths, and having military capability with little ability to build and maintain key relationships where our military strength has no influence will do little good in the longer term. Australia will never have the military power to force other nations to do our bidding. However, our power to persuade has faced systematic underfunding, and how Australia intends on backing up the Indo-Pacific defence pursuits with an understaffed diplomatic corps is questionable. Questions are raised on Australia's commitment to the Indo-Pacific in the 2020 Defence Strategic Update, as it seems to assume that countries like Indonesia will automatically assimilate Australia's concerns about the growing influence of China in the region. However, Australia seems to favour a regional security fabric underpinned by the US, and this may not be shared by Indonesia and other Southeast Asian states. In this vein, Australia requires a strong diplomatic front in all regional capitals, particularly within ASEAN, to defend its commitment to an Indo-Pacific rules-based order in such a way that it does not take a side in the Sino-US power struggle and put more stock into coalition building in the region. Australia's diplomatic efforts should be supported by strong development assistance focused on improving economic growth and human security. Third, we argue that prioritising spending on diplomacy will be more financially efficient for Australia than wasting money on military acquisitions. Australia's diplomatic deficit is large, with our network of missions overstretched and leaving Australia underrepresented. Valuable taxpayer money, which has essentially been wasted on several high-profile defence projects, should have been redirected to bolster our overseas presence. Australia has spent billions in acquisition attempts of state-of-the-art military vessels, with the most recent of which, the $89 billion attack-class submarine, facing major delays, with reports that these submarines could be inferior to those in regional service by the time they are in active duty in the 2030s. Similarly, the controversy surrounding the F-35 fighter jets suggests that they, too, will not fulfill future operational expectations compared to when Australia purchased them in 2002. Australia has, additionally, had to replace the delayed F-35s with another aircraft, leaving the project one of the most expensive of any Australian defence acquisition. We argue that instead of an absolute waste of taxpayer money in rushed defence acquisitions, Australia should redirect funding to capacity building in DFAT and relieving the strain of a struggling overseas diplomatic network. Ultimately, military actions should complement diplomatic efforts, not override them. Thank you.
The last decade has seen an erosion of multilateral institutions and the rules-based order. At the same time, the United States has signalled that it is backing away from its security commitments. In this context, Australia needs a strong military to protect itself and promote its values. We do not support cutting spending on diplomacy, and we believe that we should seek peace rather than war wherever possible. However, I will be arguing that the best approach for this and the next stage in Australia's development as a regional power will come from the projected increase in military spending as per the 2020 Defence Strategic Update. I will approach this argument through two main points, being the ADF's on-the-ground assistance in collaboration with other key players and the changing regional arena. The first speaker for the Affirmative team raised three arguments. Firstly, they argued that deterrence would not be a sufficient role for the military in the Pacific. However, we argue that island states are not the target for such deterrence and that their role is instead through diplomacy that can come from the military. Secondly, they raised that the responsibility to our neighbours would be impacted if we were to increase defence spending. We argued that resilience is better protected through military support, including the technological advancements and the assistance that we can provide through this. Thirdly, diplomacy over defence, being argued to be financially not efficient, is in response to poor spending rather than military funding in general. Having responded to the affirmative arguments, I will now move on to our case. Firstly, I would like to outline how military spending is not mutually exclusive or divorced from diplomatic and development efforts. One example of this is how the Australian military is placed to respond effectively to national disasters, having natural strengths in areas such as communications, logistics, and providing transportation. Their expertise is not a silo of skills, as the ADF can work in collaboration with other arms of the government and civil society to do so with ease. We saw this when the ADF delivered emergency stores to Beirut after the August explosion in collaboration with Australia Aid. There have also been a small team of ADF personnel who've remained deployed in Beirut since the explosion to help the Australian Embassy with communications and medical support on the ground, highlighting their role in assisting diplomatic efforts. Further, there is the concept of defence diplomacy, which happens both at a small scale through individuals or small groups, as well as through large-scale interaction during training or exercises. As Australia seeks to develop its regional role in the South Pacific, joint military exercises such as the Australian-Singapore Military Training Initiative could be increasingly more effective and in creating long-lasting relationships of trust. If we reduce military spending, we will not be able to participate in many of these initiatives, and our relationships will deteriorate. Secondly, the increase in military spending is vital to protect Australia's interests and to maintain its regional role, as the US steps back from its role as protector and China becomes more assertive. We need a military that is capable of shaping, deterring, and responding in our region. The shape element of the ADF's important role can be seen through its promotion of a rules-based order. As the impact of COVID-19 continues to affect the world, we are already able to tell that the post-COVID world is likely to be poorer, more dangerous, and more disorderly. When Prime Minister Scott Morrison announced the new shift in the defence strategy, he described it to be in response to a new reality where traditional institutions and patterns of cooperation are under strain, and Australia may be required to be a shaper regionally. Next, deterrence is also covered in the update, as the increase in military technologies, such as long-range military weapons, act as part of the strategy. The investment in technology actively attempts to avoid wars, while upping Australia's ability for self-defence. This approach is somewhat hailing from a Cold War mindset, in the way that it allows for assured peace. However, it recognises that Australia can no longer rely on a largely defensive force and must bring in new capabilities to hold adversaries at risk from a greater distance. And a key role for the ADF in deterrence is the development of new technologies, which requires more funding. We agree with this, and we argue that in this new world of zero-sum games, there is a need for new security, which unfortunately will not come from traditional methods of standalone diplomacy, as states build walls and prioritise self-interest over collective gain. In summation, it is clear that military spending can protect Australia's interests and promote its regional role, often with the benefit of increased diplomatic advantages, as illustrated by the arguments raised above. Thank you.
Good evening. Firstly, I would like to respond to the arguments of the negative team. It's evident that the negative team is stuck in the past. Although they are talking about how the military will help us in the future, the reality is that diplomacy is far from a traditional method. It's always evolving, and the military methods are not helping us move forward in a world that is struck by new crises, which I will talk about in a moment. The negative team mentioned that the ADF is very useful with helping on the ground assistance, whether it's in Australia or abroad, as the example was in Beirut. However, this is because of the funding that the ADF and the defence in general receives. This is not part of the military as it works just as the military. Therefore, if diplomacy and development were able to receive even a percentage of the same amount of funding, they too would be able to help in a much more realistic and practical on-the-ground manner. Let's not forget that the ADF is helping the embassy in Beirut. They're the ones who actually have the knowledge of what that country requires in a time of disaster. Without the diplomats understanding the context within which they work, the ADF would be of useless assistance. The negative team also spoke about a world in which the US is becoming more isolationist, and that as a result, Australia needs to be able to protect itself. Now, the increasing isolationism of the US means there is less need for Australian military. Most of our operations in defence were just following the US into conflicts and interventions that they asked us to join. Australia is far from powerless without the US, and that is because of our good diplomatic ties that we've made with other allies around the globe, such as in Southeast Asia, in the UK and the EU. Domestic military is more than sufficient to do what it needs to do. Instead, with the dwindling power of the US and the rising power of China, Australia should take its role as a middle power to the fore and become the diplomatic in-between man between these two countries and able to negotiate deals that work for Australians. Finally, on the points of the negative team, the first speaker argued that defence does use diplomacy and that the technology of defence is what will help us in the future. However, as I said, diplomacy is far from a traditional method. It's not just diplomats going and shaking hands and making deals. It's understanding how a country works, what it needs, and how it can better Australia, whether that's through trade or development or other negotiations. This is another way of building resilience. Not to say that the military isn't necessary, but that diplomacy and development should be of an equal priority. Now I would like to move to my arguments for this evening. To further support the Affirmatives team case, I will highlight the more integral role diplomacy plays in the current era of crises and how development creates important connections that would otherwise not exist. The world of today and tomorrow requires diplomacy more than the military in times of crisis. Crises are when a government shows its true colours and also exemplify where taxpayers' money should consider being invested most. We only need to take the current COVID-19 pandemic as an example to see that it is diplomats over army personnel who play a more integral role in dealing with the emerging crises of our time. At the onset of the pandemic, DFAT worked tirelessly to help Australians stranded overseas due to border closures return home. This consisted of assisting more than 300,000 citizens and permanent residents return, and in addition there were 22,000 Australians returned home thanks to the direct work of diplomats. This is evidently part of the importance of on-the-ground connections. Along with returning Australians home, diplomacy and development are key to negotiations regarding the rollout of a future vaccine. The Prime Minister, Scott Morrison, has pledged to ensure early access to a vaccine via Australia to the countries in our Pacific family and Southeast Asia. Returning to Nimaya's point about our moral obligation to help our neighbours, once again, in times of crisis, this rings true. Military spending will do little to nothing to contribute to the mission to make sure the vaccine is accessible and affordable for all. Similarly, negotiating travel bubbles with other countries, such as New Zealand, rely on strong and trustworthy diplomatic relations. DFAT's current understaffing and decreasing number of overseas postings means it is difficult to build the rapport and trust necessary for such negotiation in times of trouble. However, COVID-19 is just one example of many that require a larger foreign service and less reliance on our defence and allyship with the US for security. The climate crisis is the most demanding challenge of our generation, and we deserve a government that prioritises a global response. This will not be possible with guns and submarines. Instead, it will require an increased number of climate negotiators, aid for climate refugees, and encouraging the international community to act quickly. Diplomacy and development are the foundations of the climate activism we need. Secondly, development creates connections and relations that would otherwise not exist. It is difficult to understand that it's not difficult to understand that defence partnerships are significantly more volatile and temperamental than the long-lasting diplomatic and development relations. A prime example is the recent cut that has been made to Australia's bilateral aid to Pakistan after redirecting the funding to the Pacific. Development programs such as those that have been running in Pakistan offer the two governments the opportunity to work together, collaborate, create dialogue and a more cooperative relationship. In this particular case, not only has the aid been investing in education and health, it is also key to seeking resolution in the conflict in neighbouring Afghanistan. Once the bilateral relationship with the Pakistani government has ended, Australia vacates the space. This leaves others to take our place, diminishing our influence and likely quashing future opportunities for cooperation. There are significant limitations to inter-country relations being solely developed through the military. However, diplomacy and development are far more useful and universal. Nimaya's point about the importance of Australia's development connections in the Pacific only further speaks to the possibilities of expanding such programs to other regions of need. Indeed, regions such as Sub-Saharan Africa and Central America have few other options to cooperate and connect with Australia. Evidently, the prioritisation of diplomatic and development efforts is essential for our world that our generation is going to inherit. Thank you.
Our position tonight is not of a hawkish, warmongering government. Military spending does not equate to war, and in fact, Amelia has compellingly argued why it can be a deterrent. We do not think that military spending should be the superseding pillar out of the three that we've discussed tonight, and we acknowledge that diplomatic and development efforts are vital in a state's foreign policy toolkit. Instead, we are advocating that all three be equally prioritised. The military must continue to play a salient role in a world where the international order, as we know it, is disintegrating. There's a shift in the global hegemony from the US to China, and COVID-19 has revealed the zero-sum game approach nations take to common problems. So before moving on to my substantive, I'll address the points made by the opposition. So from the first speaker, we heard from Nimaya that Australia has this responsibility to our neighbours, especially the Pacific Islands, and that there are long-term benefits and financial benefits of focusing on development and diplomacy. Now, we agree that having global harmony requires diplomacy, and we acknowledge the vital role that diplomacy plays, for example, in helping us understand other cultures. And I will actually be focusing on the Pacific as a case study for how military spending has played an integral role in the region later on in my substantive. But we think that the opposition has wrongly characterised what defence spending actually entails. It's not just about spending money on artillery and weaponry, but in fact we acknowledge that that might not be a bad thing anyways. For example, vehicles like submarines are really vital when we have natural disasters. And while we acknowledge that military spending may have been wrongly prioritised in the past, we think that the institution itself is not flawed, and that with readjustments, for example, towards focusing on creating a better culture within the ADF or mental health initiatives, that military spending in the future will be equally as effective as diplomatic and development efforts. On to the second speaker. So from Evangeline, we first heard that diplomacy is especially integral in periods like this where we have a crisis such as COVID-19. But we would say that COVID-19 is exactly a kind of situation where the dog-eat-dog mentality of nations has been revealed. And if previous diseases such as SARS are any lessons for today, or we've actually kind of seen this happening and unfolding in today's circumstances, but governments are safeguarding, medical breakthroughs and sinking billions of dollars into hoarding potential COVID-19 vaccines. And this is exactly opposite to the kind of mentality that diplomacy should be fostering. And again, I will be using COVID-19 as a case study for how the military is effective in these situations of crises. And the last point from the opposition is that diplomacy and development efforts allow us to connect with countries and form relationships that otherwise would not exist. But we would say that these kinds of relationships can also be forged through military-led initiatives, for example, war games. So I will continue the case for the negative by discussing two further points. First, the incidental benefits of having a robust military which extend outside the international affairs landscape, and second, the negative implications of development aid. So on to my first point. 2020 has proven to be fruitful in terms of demonstrating what benefits unrelated to defence a well-funded military can provide. One tends to think of the ADF's role as one of protecting Australia against foreign threats, but few realise the humanitarian and disaster relief efforts the ADF are involved with domestically. That is, until this year. So in response to the devastating bushfires that ravaged Australia last summer, 5,400 ADF personnel, including 1,400 reservists, were on the ground assisting local communities. And they were involved with things like clearing roads and firebacks, repairing fencing, purifying water, and delivering fuel and fodder. And as climate change intensifies and makes more frequent these natural disasters, we can only see the ADF playing an increasingly greater role. And as I mentioned previously, COVID-19 has been another revealing case study. So Dr. Charles Knight wrote in an AIIA article actually earlier this year about the larger role the ADF has been playing in responding to the coronavirus and the enormous psychological and physical benefits the ADF delivers to the front line. So 2,000 ADF personnel were deployed to Operation COVID Assist, and another 1,000 have been further deployed to support Victoria in light of their kind of second wave. And another benefit incidental to defence is the regional assistance the ADF provides to our Pacific partners through agendas such as Pacific Step Up, which the government initiated in 2016. The ADF supported Papua New Guinea in hosting the Asia-Pacific Economic Cooperation Forum and helped the Solomon Islands run their first national general election. And we think that these are benefits that the opposition were also trying to advocate for. Moving on to my second point, which is that development aid has negative implications and connotations in that it is colonialist, supports corrupt governments, and is ineffective. So first, the development aid system perpetuates the colonial project in that it assumes affected populations suffer from certain problems and deliver aid based on this assumption. And an added irony, of course, is that many of these vulnerable nations were previously European colonies, and the problems they currently suffer from stem from that period of time. Development aid perpetuates this sort of paternalism shaped by Christian philosophy and values, which relies on the technical expertise of outsiders like Australians, while ignoring local knowledge that currently exists. The decision-making that occurs often belies any genuine engagement and collaboration and is approached in a top-down sort of fashion. The Millennium Villages project in Uganda is one such example. While new crops and farming methods increased crop yield significantly, there was no market for them and they soon rotted. Secondly, development aid supports corrupt governments in two forms, through bureaucratic corruption and political corruption. And this kind of collusive activity permeates across many layers of government, from the decision-making and policy formulation of the top of the hierarchy, all the way down to implementation of the lower bureaucratic level. And typical examples of this include bribery for project contracts, fraudulent practices such as amendments and extensions once contracts are entered into, diverting project equipment for personal use, and misusing money. And lastly, development aid is ineffective in addressing many of the actual problems faced by local populations. And one of the most insidious problems is the conditions imposed on development aid, which might require recipient governments to reduce health or social services spending in order to receive aid. So yes, that concludes the case for the negative.
The first question I'll ask when we're deciding how Australia should spend our budget money is, what exactly are Australia's more important interests? And what we tell you on the Affirmative team is that there are many interests for Australia that go beyond that which can be reached by military spending. We tell you at First Affirmative that there are moral debts and obligations that we owe to islands that we are hurting through climate change or who we had promised to help. There are obligations to our economic development that can be best served through negotiating free trade agreements, through having diplomatic corps that are trusted. We tell you that there are prioritizations for healthcare, which in the current crisis is best served by having a global community that works together through a well-funded diplomatic corps, rather than the threats and the deterrence that comes from military spending. And that there are important interests in education or in protecting the climate and the environment. And all of those interests are only able to be helped by an Australian government that recognises the importance of development aid and recognises the importance of Australia's diplomatic corps and those being well-funded institutions that are able to have diplomats and ambassadors in every country, that are able to have people who are well-researched when they are making those decisions, and that they are able to reach out and form those alliances that we need to tackle the problems of today and the problems of tomorrow. And the claim of the negative team is that, well, maybe Australia needs to focus somewhere else, that we need to focus on our military alliances and our self-defence and our preservation. But on the Affirmative, we tell you that those things are far less under threat than those other prioritisations for Australia, that there are not direct threats to the Australian way of life bigger than the climate catastrophe, or bigger than economic downfall, or bigger than ongoing health crises. And if you were to ask average or everyday Australians, what is more important to you? Is it instability somewhere else in the world, or the possibility of China attacking? They would say, my more pressing concern is, do we have a vaccine for COVID? Do we have an economy that will promise to me to be continued to be employed in decades to come? And those are the crises and the responses that Australia should be prioritising. That is best done through a well-funded diplomatic corps and development aid that goes to countries that need it. But those things as well, as we also tell you, are better targeted through strong alliances and better funded through building bridges with countries that are strong and that are able to withstand threats from military intervention in order to deter things like invasion, or in order to negotiate and remove instability in regions that could threaten us around. And those are things that can only be done by the development aid that the Affirmative is propositioning, and are not things that are better targeted through military spending that focuses on aggression and that focuses on bullying in order to achieve the outcomes that they want. And that is why Australia's most important interests are only those that can be targeted by the Affirmative team. And that is why, coming into this debate, we are fundamentally ahead in assuming where Australia should be spending its money. I will now ask, what better achieves those interests, given I've told you we should prioritise those ones that are not strictly military? And here again, I think the Affirmative team gets up in a very important way, which is that if you consider the efficiency of spending and where every single dollar goes, you are more able to get efficient and just outcomes by spending in areas that are currently underfunded, or areas that are able to spend more efficiently. So it is true that in order to have a well-advanced military, or a technologically equipped one, as First Negative would want us to have, that requires the billions of dollars on submarines and on F-35 fighter jets that we tell you lead to wasted money and that lead to them being obsolete the moment they come off the production line. And that means it is a deeply inefficient way in order to prioritise Australia's interests. And if we compare that to the number of salaries of DFAT officials or the number of dollars we could put in the pockets of people in poverty overseas, those are in no way the way in which Australia should be spending the money that it has, and is not an effective nor an efficient way of targeting what it should be doing. I'll now question what better achieves the diplomatic or those health or economic and environmental causes of Australia. The claim from the negative is twofold. The first is, well, the military is also a good way of targeting development or targeting aid, that the ADF has a large number of responsibilities that allow it to be an effective diplomat. We'd point out a number of problems with this. The first is that it assumes the status quo as inevitable. That yes, it is true the ADF has more bases and more population and a better communication system than DFAT or than Australian aid organisations do, but that is because they are given $36 billion a year while the others are forced to survive on 1 or 2. And if you think about the reprioritisation of that funding, it seems far more possible that Australia would have diplomats all over the world. Secondly, they are worse at providing that aid. That yeah, you are able to send soldiers into places, but in areas where soldiers are not trusted, as is a major problem in Lebanon, that is not an effective way of helping. And most problematically, it legitimizes narratives that aid is, or people providing aid are a Trojan horse for the military, which allows dictators or allows people who do not want soldiers coming in to say, or they are not merely aid workers, they are done through the ADF, which is the most effective way to starve or to deny basic rights to a population. Aid and the military should not be combined, and it is dangerous to do so. The second claim of the negative is you can achieve political goals through military alliances. But military alliances, unlike other forms of alliances, are far more of a zero-sum game. You're able to have a trade alliance with the US, but not with China, but the moment that you are doing war games with the US in the South China Sea, that cuts off your ability to negotiate or have meaningful alliances with other groups. That you are able to have multiple agreements on education, on healthcare, on the economy, and on climate with both Japan and Korea, but you are not able to do military alliances and military war games with both of those countries, which is why it forces Australia to pick and choose alliances in ways that is bad, especially because we often pick and choose in ways that are not useful for us and have us pick, for example, America when it would not be a strategic ally for us to have. But secondly, they are less stable than other forms of alliances. The alliances that are built on deep mutual respect and trust are able to last into the future, but once your submarine or once your fighter jet is now an obsolete model, that war game or that military-based alliance is not able to serve you any purpose. So that is yet another way in which it is more efficient for Australia to invest in the future and invest in the future of diplomacy. But even to the extent that there is a geostrategic interest for Australia, we are better able to target that. That targeting the causes of instability, which are political instability, which are poverty, through development aid and through diplomacy is more effective. The most effective barrier against conflict and violence is free trade in the modern world, and that is what we give you better. And to the extent that there are problems with the way in which development aid is spent, those are reasons to reform development aid, to make it less colonial, to put less money in the pockets of dictators, but it is not a reason to abandon the aid programs of Australia and to abandon the countries that need it the most. And if you think about it otherwise, that is the team that supports the military, likely the far more colonial and far more problematic interest for this. We are a team that looks to the future, we are a team that looks to stability, and that is best served without an overfunded military. Proud to affirm.
The affirmative team establishes a series of false dichotomies in this debate. They tell us we can have DFAT or an army. They tell us we can have diplomacy or deterrence. But the interesting and more nuanced insight that you get from the negative team is that Not only can we do both of these things pragmatically, but also that the two are better in concert, that our diplomatic efforts are strengthened by a military backing, that our army is a vital part of development and disaster relief efforts, so it doesn't make sense to prioritise one over the other because you undermine both. I'm going to answer two questions in this speech. The first of which is what's better for Australia and its allies' security. The second of which is what's better for for civilian kind of efforts like climate change and disaster relief. Firstly, on security. We would posit, contrary to Thomas's assertion, that this is the most important question in this debate because the primary obligation of a democratic state's foreign policy is to maintain its sovereign independence, to protect the basic security and livelihood of its citizens and that of its allies. What do they tell us? They say at Nimaya that it's better to build relationships than rely on deterrence. Two responses. Firstly, we explained to you why military spending gives us opportunities and unique opportunities to strengthen those relationships. We can conduct joint exercises as we do with Indonesia, the Philippines, and Singapore. We can collaborate with intelligence like we do with the Five Eyes community. Thomas tells us these are unstable, but we would posit that this is the most powerful kind of relationship because it's not just based on a kind of commonality of ideas and values, it's based on mutual reliance in a security sense. If they invade us, we need these people to collaborate with. But secondly, we tell you that the context of this debate is one in which we can't rely on relationships alone. There is a breakdown of the security arrangements that underlie those relationships in a context of nationalism, withdrawal from multilateral institutions, the loss of US leadership in the world stage, and COVID leading to distrust between nations. It means that we have to have that military backing to our diplomatic efforts. This takes two forms. Firstly, it takes the form of having a strong military that gives us credible bargaining power in our relations with other states. This looks like offering protection to those Pacific islands that the Affirmative team cared so much about in return for them aligning with us in foreign policy, which means that they're not forced to submit to Chinese hegemony when Beijing goes knocking at their door. The second way it helps us is it provides us with credible deterrence for the invasion of Australia and its allies. The Affirmative team wants to wave this away and tell us that Australia would never be invaded, but two things to note here. Firstly, we are in a uniquely weak historical position. Australia has never been so abandoned by its traditional protectors, the United Kingdom and the United States. It seems unthinkable, but it could happen and it would be awful. But secondly, it's not about actually being invaded. The credible threat that it might be in another country's interests to invade us allows them to have a kind of power over us that we would never want to give them. We don't give it to them when we have an army that would make it difficult for them to invade us with. The last thing they tell us on this issue of security is that diplomacy is more resource effective in terms of preventing war, because we waste money on dodgy submarines is the example they give us. Two responses again. Firstly, this is just an argument for having a better tender process for military technology. We could probably have a better tender process if we had more money in the army. But secondly, bilateral diplomacy is literally the most resource ineffective concept in existence, right? You have to have a diplomatic mission in every country in the world, as opposed to just having a good army that means you wouldn't want to invade us. But also, it's a zero-sum game, right? Like whatever Thomas wants to tell you, China does get annoyed when you have free trade relationships with its rivals. That's something that doesn't happen when you just have an army that means they don't want to invade you. So we were the team that provided security to Australia and its allies. Second question, what's best for civilian operations relating to development, disaster relief, climate change, and all of that? Nimaya tells us that there's a moral obligation to provide assistance in these realms. But what we tell you at Wendy is that there are good reasons to be suspicious of the capacity of development assistance to meet that moral obligation. It can be paternalistic, it can be self-serving, and it can be neo-colonialist, which means that we forfeit that moral imperative and we undermine our long-term relationships with its recipients. We don't get a response from Thomas, but let's presume for the sake of a healthy debate that development assistance in general is good. What we tell you again here is that there's a false dichotomy. The Australian Defence Force is flexible and capable of being deployed for civilian or military operations. I will note that the inverse of that is clearly not true. But also, we explained to you why the ADF was uniquely good at some aspects of development and disaster relief. It had strict lines of command. It could order people to go overseas tomorrow if they're needed. It has institutional experience with rapidly deploying people and scaling up operations in foreign environments. And thirdly, it has access to experience with equipment that you couldn't transfer to a civilian organisation such as surveillance technology and military helicopters that have civilian applications. What Thomas tells us is that in some cases, the use of the military is inappropriate, for example, Lebanon. That's why we have DFAT as well. We don't have to use the army for every civilian application. Having the flexibility to use each makes us stronger and makes our responses better. But even if they can demonstrate that our kind of civilian applications, our disaster relief, our climate responses would be slightly better in the absence of that army, because that army is so necessary for our security arrangements, we win this debate. Thank you.
Well, many thanks to our speakers. And it's now time for the adjudication. Our adjudication tonight is being given by Kevin Boreham, who recently completed 18 years teaching international law at the Australian National University. His earlier careers were as a solicitor and as a diplomat. Kevin.
Thank you, Ian, and thanks to all of the speakers in this debate this evening. I found it a very vigorously argued and well-informed debate, with cases which were set up very well on both sides. And I think we had a very good exposure to the current issues of development and diplomacy versus spending on the military. So I think we come away from this debate all better informed for having heard such a vigorous and interesting discussion. Just to briefly refer to the cases as they were developed on both sides, I thought the affirmative set up their arguments very well. I thought that Nimaya dealt very effectively with the role of development assistance and diplomacy and the role that it plays in the current international scene. I thought that Evangeline also did a very competent job of explaining what diplomacy did, that it wasn't, as she said, a matter of just shaking hands at cocktail parties, but that diplomacy had an important role in informing national policy. So I thought that the first two speakers for the affirmative set up the role of diplomacy and development assistance very ably. And I thought Thomas, coming in as the third speaker, brought those arguments together very ably by addressing the question of priorities and referring to the fact that major international issues, climate change particularly, and the COVID pandemic, were not very open to military spending, or military spending couldn't be spent on it very effectively, and that therefore we needed to assign greater priority to development assistance and diplomacy in the current international situation. I thought that referring to the way the affirmative case was developed, although, as I say, it was quite impressive, the issue of priorities probably could have been brought out more strongly earlier in the affirmative case. And although the affirmative case was very able and very interesting, I thought that the affirmative did leave yourselves open somewhat to the attack from the negative, which was brought together in Marcus's third speech, where he accused you of putting forward false dichotomies. And although, as I say, you could well say that these other issues were explored very ably by you, which was certainly the case, I thought that this issue of priorities probably needed to be developed earlier in your case, because it possibly could have anticipated the sort of case that we had from the negative, which was we don't need to choose, we can have all these things, they work together, and so on. So very well done on the affirmative side, and very good explanation of the role of development assistance and diplomacy, but perhaps needed to come to grips with the issue of priorities a little earlier in the way you developed your case. The negative, I thought, set up your case very ably, and the theme that you developed, that we don't need to choose, diplomacy, development assistance and military spending all work together and reinforce each other, they all have their role, we don't need to choose, came through reasonably effectively in all three of your speeches. So I thought that theme was quite well developed. I thought that you could have developed a little more the question of the way that military spending works together with diplomacy and development assistance. It was there, but it occurred to me listening to you that the comment that was made by General James Mattis, who of course was Defence Secretary in the earlier phase of the Trump administration, when he said, when he was still in active military service, testifying before a congressional committee, that if Congress didn't fund the State Department more effectively, then he would require more ammunition. So although I think that theme of these elements working together was certainly there and quite convincingly argued, I thought perhaps you could have brought them together conceptually a little bit more strongly. I thought that the negative brought your arguments together fairly effectively in Marcus's third speech. I thought perhaps you could have made reference to what Thomas had been saying about current issues, because the attack of false dichotomies, I thought, was more effectively launched against the first and second speakers for the affirmative than against the third speaker. But still, as any debater knows, picking up an argument when you're about to get on your feet, thinking through what you have to say is not an easy thing to do. But I thought perhaps you could have weaved in one or two references to what Thomas had said. So overall, I thought a very effective debate. A couple of issues I thought could have been brought out a bit more strongly. One was the issue of spending, particularly in the context of the current Australian budget, which of course is hurtling into the red. Could have been developed a little bit more by both sides. And I also thought that the complexity of our relations with China, although it was referred to on the negative side, possibly needed more emphasis because it comes front and centre in these issues because of the military issues concerning China, particularly in the South China Sea. So I thought those two issues, spending and the relationship with China, could have been developed rather more. But as I say, on both sides, very effective arguments, very effectively made. I think, as we've heard from what I've just said, I thought the negative just edged ahead because your arguments about diplomacy and development assistance defence, with they all work together, we don't need to choose, was perhaps more consistently developed through your three speeches. Whereas on the affirmative, although very impressively done, I thought the issue of priorities needed to be brought out a little bit more strongly earlier. So very well done on both sides. I award the debate very narrowly to the negative, but very well done on both sides.
Well, many thanks, Kevin. That brings our event to an end. Thanks to all of the participants for a very lively and very interesting evening, and to all of you who are watching us. I hope you've enjoyed partly being with us, at least through the magic of broadcast, and we look forward to doing similar events in the future. Thank you.